Hi, I'm MG Boutet. Welcome to Druid Talks. Today's subject will be about genetics and DNA and genealogy and how these things can be put together to get a good picture of who we are and where we come from. But before, I'd like to speak of the myths surrounding origins of peoples, especially the Euro-genius peoples of North America, like the French Canadians. Let's go into this a bit. François Legault was in Paris recently, and he met with Macron, the president of France, and where he claimed that, we have so many historical ties, French Canada and France, because of our Latin origins, or Latin identity. Of course, this is a complete fallacy. There is nothing Latin in French Canadian culture, and except for part of the language, and of course, in the olden days, because of religion, all those who had been schooled in the Roman Catholic schools were Latinists, in the sense that they had to learn Latin, and the Latin was the language of the church. And so in that sense, yes, there's this Latin culture that was tied to us, but this, of course, it tended to be exaggerated a bit. So here is a book by Jean-Marie Récolfils, which discusses the origins of the French language, and in which he maintains that more than 30% of it is from Celtic, from Gallic. Of course, this mainly the vocabulary, but there is some of the grammar also, some of the verbs, the constructions are from Gallic. So in that sense, French is a language that is stratified. The substrata is Gallic, the media strata, the middle strata, is Latin, and the superstrata is Germanic. Of course, it could be from Frankish or Viking, Norman origin. And so, for example, canif comes from knife. This is Germanic word, of course. In this book here, a-t-on oublié que jadis nous étions frères, which touches on the relations of Champlain and the Inuit Montagnais, Anada-Bijou, the chief, and in which the French and the Algonquian tribes had reached an agreement where the two nations would coexist and cooperate with each other. And in this situation, many have long thought that the French Canadians were métis from the French colony of Canada in the valley of St. Lawrence, the St. Lawrence River, that were métis. But this, of course, is not the case because the seigneurial system was a closed society where the European settlers were separated from the native Canadian and the Native American tribes, and had no relationship whatsoever, and there was very little marriage from one ethnic group to another, or one cultural group from another. So in that sense, French Canadian remained quite separated in time and space from the Native Americans in that sense. And here Marcel Trudel, he discusses with Jacques Rousseau, where he mentions that according to him, like in Mexico, there would have been a lot of mixing, and where he thinks, as a historian, there could have been just as much as 25% mixed with Native Americans and the European French, which of course is not the case, and we will find out through the DNA, of course. This will be settled once and for all. And where he also says, well, this was for the 400th anniversary of Quebec City, the founding of Quebec City, and there was much discussion on, today in today's political correct world, it isn't acceptable to say that one group is pretty much homogeneous. One group is from a homogeneous origin of some kind, and so there has to be a hodgepodge of mixing and things like that to make it acceptable politically, And so, but one thing's sure though, one thing happened is that after the British conquest, the Scots, the Irish, and in a little smaller part the English mixed in with the French Canadians, and there was a mixing, but of Western Europeans. And in that sense, you can't call it a métis society. There's no way. And so this, to dispel the myths of the mix, there was this situation where in the French Indian Wars with the British colonists in New England, they saw the French fighting along with the Indians and concluded that in that sense they had to be closely related, but they were probably just politically related and had no blood ties whatsoever. And so here, there's another book here. It's by Leslie Choquette, Franco-American, and it's called De Français à Paysan, from French to peasant. And in here, you have a countdown of all of the percentages of settlers who came to the Canadian colony of either Acadie or Canada, the St. Lawrence Valley, and from which provinces in France they were from. And so Brittany was 16.9%, Normandy was 15.5%, Aunis 10%, Ile-de-France 8%, Poitou 5%, and then there was some other places like Anjou and Perche. They're all around 3 to 2%, and so this is very much in the area of Western France, and so this is the area also that was very influenced or touched by the passing of the crowns. The French king would lose a war against the English king, and then England would take part of Western France, and that was under the Plantagenet regime. And so in Maine or Brittany and Poitou and Normandy and all these areas, the House of Anjou, the Plantagenets, and so there were people who moved around from one royal territory to another, and this explains a lot the very, very close genetic ties of the Western French and the insular people. And this is one of them, but not all of them. Of course, there's also the diaspora of the Welsh, or the pre-Welsh, or the old British, who fled the Anglo-Saxon Danish invasions, and so they ended up on the coast of Armorica and on the coast of Poitou in Vendée. And so this is pretty much the picture. So now we'll go on to the genetics explained by genealogy. This is really the way to complete an overall picture, the way to go if you really want to understand where you're from and who you are and what is your allegiance of some kind. And so one way to do it is to go with the parents, of course, but for me, I thought I discovered that the easiest way was to use the 4 grandparents and go up each of the 4 grandparents, and this way there was a bit more detail there for the genealogy, as for, let's say, the direct DNA links, as for the Y DNA on the father's side and the mitochondrial DNA on the mother's side. As for the DNA aspects, I had mine done by Geno 2.0, next generation by National Geographic. This is very interesting in the way that it's quite detailed. It gives the haplogroups and along with that the Neanderthal blood. And so this differs much from the others. Let's say others like Ancestry don't give the haplogroups. This is So now we're going to look into this. Okay, so I'll start with my paternal grandfather. Logically, his name was Maurice Boutet. My father's name was Gérald Boutet. And Maurice Boutet was the son of, the oldest son of Joseph Boutet and Eudalie Hébert, who had a farm in Victoriaville, Quebec. And so his earliest ancestor was, who came to Canada was Jean Boutet, and he was the son of a Marie Boeuf and a Guillaume Boutet, who were from Saint-Hilaire-sur-Otise in the departments of La Vienne, in Vendée, Deux-Sèvres, on the Atlantic side of Poitou, just below Armorica. And in the old days, this area of Poitou was tied to Brittany or Armorica, and in that the name Vendée comes from Venette, which were the Celtic mariners. Julius Caesar mentions them in his wars, his Gaelic wars, who were the ones who would ship people from one side to another of the English Channel. And so you can say that the sea was quite a normal thing for them. In fact, Jean Boutet, the ancestor from France, he was an orphan when he left France in those days. And he was a mariner. He came by boat, and what he did is that as soon as he realized that he could make a living in the Canadian colony, he jumped boat and went to work as a laborer on a farm near Quebec City. And so this Jean Boutet, he then gets married around 1687 in Quebec City with a Marie Guérin, and they later on save enough money to buy themselves their own farm in the seigneurie, and of Charlebourg, which is near Quebec City, and they have many children. This first Canadian-born René Boutet was born on the 30th of December 1709, and he was baptized in Charlebourg, and he married Elisabeth Félicité Liret, lineage from the 21 from the British Isles. Now, his mother was Eudalie Hébert. She was of Acadian descent, and the Hébert were a very famous family with the Acadians. So maybe you can touch a bit on that because we'll get to see more what happened with the Acadians and with part of my maternal grandfather's family, who was exactly on the other side of the equation. So this is so my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, Eudalie Hébert, she was the daughter of Petrus Hébert, who was the brother of Louis-Philippe Hébert, who was a very famous Canadian sculptor who had his workshop, his studio in Paris, and he did much of the monumental work for the different cities in Canada. And he made himself very well known by this. The Hébert family, they had been deported from Acadia. They ended up on the coast of New England. They made their way into Louisiana. Some of them decided to go back to Canada, and they moved up to Quebec, and he met some of his sisters there, and the meeting with his long lost fiancée that he had been separated from since the deportation was the subject for Longfellow's poem of Evangeline. The other Hébert also have quite a story. Étienne Hébert was a very, very well-known soldier. See, there were three brothers of the Héberts that made it back up to Canada. There was Étienne Hébert, of course. There's a biography of Étienne Hébert in the Canadian Encyclopedia. Of course, he was the son of Jean-Baptiste Hébert and Élisabeth Granger, who later ended up in Saint-Grégoire, Bécancour, Nicolet in Quebec. And Étienne belonged to the fourth generation of the Hébert in Acadia. The deportation occurred in 1755 and separated him from his family at the age of 19. He was sent to Baltimore in Maryland, which was almost the only American colony to show any sympathy for the unhappy Acadians who were separated from their families. And the fact that many of the inhabitants of Maryland were Catholics and who had been sheltered in England by Lord Baltimore and his brother Leonard Calvert may account for this kindly response from the people. Hébert was able to take advantage of this favorable attitude and was placed in the service of an army officer who quickly became his friend. He gradually acquired not only substantial savings, but above all, valuable experience in particular. He learned how to make his way through the great stretches of the forest and along lakes and rivers, as well as over portages known only to a few. And with this experience, he could tackle the project that had been taking shape in his mind from the time he had arrived in Maryland to find his parents, three brothers and four sisters. This was no mean task, since the policy of deportation had been in effect until 1762, increasing the ranks of the exiles, who in addition had been widely dispersed. The Acadians were to be found in all of the British colonies from Massachusetts to Georgia. So many of them fled to Louisiana. The large number who were scattered in most of these states, which were very distant from another, had to find ways of regrouping and had to know where the others had been sent, and this was very difficult, and it was only through hearsay. And so Hébert succeeded in finding his father, mother, and brother Jean-Baptiste in the colony at Georgetown, but no trace of the others was found. And in 1763 came the secession of New France and the complete impossibility to return to Acadia. And the interdiction was lifted the following year, but with the provision that the Acadians would take oath of allegiance. And in 1764, 1765, Hébert made his way up and made his mind to return to Canada, where the British had settled an agreement with the French colonists. And this is what his main objective was, to return. And so he knew that Three Rivers was about 100 leagues away, and he set out on his own in that direction with a compass, an axe, a musket, a tinderbox, saucepan, and a birch bark canoe. And after many adventures, he wound up among the Acadian refugees near Nicolet and Saint-Grégoire, and then was then called Sainte-Marguerite. At first he was disappointed to find none of his family were there, but having been advised to cross the St. Lawrence to Petite Acadie, a row of concessions in Yamachiche where some of the Acadians were living, he had the great joy of finding his sisters Marguerite, Françoise, and Marie. And since he felt that he could gather his family together in the region, he bought 4 adjoining properties in the upper part of the village of Saint-Grégoire, and soon after he left for Boston, where he had chosen as a gathering point for the rest of the family and many of the other exiles whom he had been asked to bring back when he was in Canada. And so he organized veritable expeditions, assembling 5 to 10 families to travel from Boston to Trois-Rivières, and this overland. And from the autumn of 1766, the registries of birth, marriages, and deaths attest to the arrival of a great number of these Acadian exiles. And in 1767, he bought his parents and brother Jean-Baptiste, but exile and rigorous part of the voyage proved that for his parents and brother Jean, it was a bit too much. And with the rigors of the voyage, it proved fatal for his mother, who was buried at the age of 66 in Trois-Rivières. On the 3rd of October 1767, Hébert was also successful in his research for his sister Anne and his brothers Joseph and Honoré, so that by 1771, or even earlier, the entire Hébert family was finally reunited, the immediate family. Of course, many of his cousins remained in the States, so most of them decided to flee to Louisiana. So a great part of the rest of the family, uncles and cousins, settled in Louisiana. In the course of his searches, Hébert also found Marie-Joseph Babin, a girl from his native region of Acadia. She was 24 and he was 33 when they were married at Trois-Rivières. And so this is this reunion, and this is what Longfellow we was inspired by this story to write Evangeline, of course. Jean-Baptiste Hébert, a captain, and he was very famous during the rebellion of 1837-1838. He was sent to prison by the Brits for this, the British Army. I think these Acadians had a grudge, an inner grudge against everything that was British after what happened to them. He wasn't the only Hébert that was involved in as a military captain, as was Étienne Hébert, his father. The cousins in Louisiana were all quite famous. There was a Brigadier General Louis Hébert. Louis Hébert was an American educator, civil engineer, writer, soldier who became a Brigadier General in the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. So he was born in Bayou Gros, Iberville Parish, Louisiana. He was first cousin of the engineer Paul Octave Hébert. His cousin became a state militia officer and chieftain engineer of the state of Louisiana from around 1855 to 1860. So Paul Octave Hébert. The other Louis Hébert, one of his not so distant cousins, was my great uncle Louis Philippe Hébert. That's quite the story. As for my paternal grandmother, her maiden name was Florence Côté. Her family was mainly from Normandy, Perche, Brittany, and some of her close ancestors were from England, via Pas-de-Calais, and Holland. Her Dutch family was from the region of Utrecht in Holland. And so this Dutch origin doesn't fully explain why my background DNA is mainly from that area. Holland is an area from which much of the ancient Proto-Germanic DNA comes from, and this goes a bit after the Beaker culture people. This was a R1b S21, and so the Dutch origins for my paternal grandmother don't fully explain why, for the great part, my background DNA corresponds to this area. So it has certainly to do with the fact that this R1b S21, also called U106 or M405, is also very prevalent in areas such as Normandy. And this is explained also by the fact that not only the Scandinavian populations, but also the Frisian or Frankish people, these tribes were the Vandals and the Goths and the Anglo-Saxons, the Vandals, the Franks, all originated from this area. The Côté, they were originally from Caux in Normandy, and they owned many lands ever since St. Louis, the King of France. And the proof can be found in letters and assignments which were issued by that prince, dated July 1259, by which his fief of Senneville is attached with certain conditions, and the original of which was communicated by Pierre Côté, which was one of his ancestors, knight, seigneur de Friqueville, eldest of the branch of the family bearing the name, and proprietor of that same name, fief, which was given to him during the sharing of the separation of the family branches, and as always was in the family without interruption since King St. Louis. And this is confirmed by all the registries of the counts of Normandy, and on the epitaphs of Jean Côté, Seigneur d'Harfleur, who lies buried in the parish of Senneville, where he died in 1535. So Pierre Côté died in 1577 and was member of the Chamber of Counts of Normandy and counselor to the state. Jean Côté himself, he has quite a story also. So it was the Lord Giffard, Robert Giffard, who was from Mortagne and Touroux in Perche. And when he contacted Jean Côté in the area of Normandy, he offered him to go and help him recruit lumberjacks and farmers from the forests of Perche. Robert Giffard, while the legal documents that would bind Côté to his seigneur hasn't been found, because I don't think between aristocrats they would decide to become vassals to each other. So we presume that it could be stipulated that Giffard, for a period in exchange for his contract, or for the duration of this agreement, would help him with settling in Canada. So since they had a lot of cows, livestock, and things to bring with them, and laborers, and Côté was among the first Normans recruited, along with Jean Guillon, Marin, and Gaspard Boucher, and Sébastien Daudier, and Zachary Cloutier, and Pierre Paradis, and Pierre Maheu, Guillaume Isabelle, and Desportes, and all of these very, 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 very famous, widespread families all throughout North America now, with many descendants. And so these were the first in the colony after it had been established by Champlain. Jean Côté collaborates with Seigneur Giffard. He marries Anne Martin. Anne Martin, and there the Martin have also quite a story and a pedigree, which is quite the thing. Probably would have to take a separate video just to explain all of it. But needless to say that these Martin were royal pilots with the King of France. They were tradesmen. They traded with the Scots for linen and tartans and things like that. But the family originally was from Germany in the distant past, and ended up moving along from Germany to France, and then elsewhere into Canada. And so this Anne Martin was quite the character also. So it would have been natural that Jean Côté, who was a Norman aristocrat, the small aristocracy, would marry someone of that nature who was from a very, very, very rich bourgeois family in Europe. As mentioned previously, most DNA tests do not give the haplogroups, the Y or mitochondrial lineages. So it's even less when it comes to, let's say, the father's mitochondrial DNA. So in this situation, you can always look into the genealogy records, and this is what I have done. So the way to go is to go from mother to mother up until the last ancestor recorded. And what this gave for my paternal grandmother, for her mitochondrial DNA, but which I don't have the haplogroup. It leads me to a Marguerite Robineau, born in 1641 in Saint-Sulpice of Paris, France. And she was the daughter of Jeanne Liénard and Guillaume Robineau, who was a soldier of the king. And so he died during one of Louis XIII's many wars. And so the children were sent to the orphanage. This one here was the famous orphanages of the Celtic priests. Father La Bretonnière was the one who gave a few names of girls that could be sent to Canada to marry young men who were in the serving as soldiers in the King's Regiment, in order to give them wives in New France. And so this Marguerite Robineau was a fille du roi, daughter of the king, and she arrived in Quebec City on the 3rd of July 1668 on board of the Nouvelle France. The ship was called Nouvelle France, and she married therefore Michel Goron, dit Petit Bois, in Quebec City. And from this union they had many children. So if I had, let's say, if my sister did the test, or one of my cousins, female cousins, if they did the test, they would have my paternal grandmother's lineage. Again, another of her grandmothers was Philomène Landry, and she was born in Quebec, in Albertville-Arthabascan. She was of Acadian descent. So the Landry pretty much have the same history as the Hébert. The name Landry is from the Frankish Landric, king of the earth. The Landry settled in Acadia. So most of the Landry had settled Port-Royal, Acadia, in 1640. The ancestor was married to a Perrine Bourg in 1645. They're both hailed from La Rochelle. The history of the Landry is very much similar to that of the Hébert, as I mentioned. Many of them had fled by land when they heard that the others were being deported. Some stole boats like the Pembroke and made their way into the St. Lawrence River Valley and settled in Kamouraska, and the others were sent all over around Boston, and many resettled in Saint-Domingue, but many got sick and died and did not enjoy their stay there, and so they chose to resettle in Louisiana. So much like the Hébert, the Landry were deported to New England, and many made their way to Louisiana after the deportation, and some moved up to Canada, back into New Brunswick and Quebec. Okay, I hope that this helped clarify things a bit. So I'll speak to you next time. So if you enjoyed the video, please ring the bell and give a thumbs up. Thank you very much.